Hi, my name is Hannah Hutchinson, and I would like to tell you about my thesis, The Changing Attitudes of Opium in 19th Century England. At the beginning of the 19th century, there was unfettered access to opium. Anyone could buy it from a druggist. Any person from any class, any gender, was able to access opium at any time, and it didn't have to be from a doctor. Opium use in English society in the 19th century was completely unrestricted until 1868 when the first Pharmacy Act became law. A lot changed after the 1868 Pharmacy Act in terms of attitude. Opium use has a long history, expanding centuries in many countries. At the beginning of the 19th century, opium was culturally sanctioned, and opium was not always viewed as the evil that it seems to be viewed today. Attitudes about opium changed during the 19th century, and the changing attitudes towards opium are visible through class distinctions, medicinal changes, and the literature at the time. And here's a little bit about class distinctions. Opium use in 9th century England was split by classes. Upper class members were allowed to utilize opium without judgment ascribed to the lower classes. There was fear about similar habits filtering down to the poor. So basically, the upper class, it was okay for them to use opium, whereas for the lower class, it was not okay. It was looked down upon. They were looked down as, these poor working class members of society. Why would they use this? And as the century progressed, the upper class people became less interested with opium because of the lower class people being more interested in its use. And there were many opium related problems with class. A lot of preparations of opium were made for children of all classes. However, working class and lower class people tended to buy these preparations, and instances of infanticide and child overdoses and even intentional deaths, especially of bastard children, became something that happened a lot, and that was another reason for the upper class people to look down on the lower class people. With the medicinal changes, there were many medical inventions and improvements in the 19th century. For one, the hypodermic needle and the invention of morphine. This changed how opium was used and how medicine was used. Also, in the early 19th century, people did use opium for recreational purposes. However, it was under the guise and under the name of medicinal or self medication. People such as Coleridge and De Quincey said they used it for pain instead of just for pleasure, even though a lot of their works reveal that they did use it for enjoyment as well. In the literature and art section, there were many important literary minds at the time who mirrored the changing attitudes towards opium in 19th century England. Thomas De Quincey and Samuel Taylor Coleridge were often researched in regard to opium. They're always talked about. They're like the two main guys you're going to hear about when learning about opium. However, Wilkie Collins, who authored The Moonstone, and Lizzie Siddall, who was actually the wife of a pre-Raphaelite artist named Dante Gabriel Rossetti, she actually has a lot of paintings done by him about her, and she has a lot of her own drawings and poetry, which talk about topics that can be viewed as opium related. And part of my thesis is to explain these. And I didn't have enough time to put all this information about Lizzie and Wilkie and a lot of the literature in depth in this presentation. However, in my thesis, it goes very, very into depth on those connections. And I always felt that Wilkie Collins and Lizzie Siddall were overshadowed, and I wanted to make sure that they got the justice they deserved in their contributions to the works of opium in 9th century England. In literature at this time, and art also mirrored the changing attitudes towards opium use. And as you see pictured in my slide with the four photos, you have Thomas De Quincey top left, Samuel Taylor Coleridge top right, Wilkie Collins bottom left, and Lizzie Siddall top right. These are just the pictures of the people, and the works that I used are printed next to their pictures in my thesis because I thought these works were all ones that mirrored what the time felt. Starting with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, he was late 18th, early 19th century. His work on the poem Kubla Khan was massively important. when discussing opium use. And then later you have early 19th century, you have Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater. Later century, you have Lizzie Siddall, who unfortunately died from an overdose of laudanum, but she did have some fragments of works left over that I was able to examine for this thesis, which is awesome. And later in the century, past the 1868 Pharmaceutical Act, you have Wilkie Collins's The Moonstone, which starts to talk about opium medicinally, which was not a trait of the first three works. So, that means there was a change over time, and my thesis gets more and more into that. So, in conclusion, there were many factors in which contributed to the changing attitudes of opium use in 19th century England. Through my research, I have noted that lots of changes in these attitudes can be attributed to social classes, medicinal changes, and the literature at the time. Social classes changed the attitudes towards the lower classes and their use, which in turn shifted upper class people away from opium use. The medical changes during the 19th century noted many issues with opium, such as infanticide and changes in the forms of opium itself. The literature at the time mirrored the realities of the changing attitudes towards opium use. Together, these three subcategories illustrate the changed attitudes of opium in 19th century England. And the next slide is my bibliography, which has the sources that I used just for this specific presentation. However, I expounded upon many more sources, such as the Old Bailey and Punch Magazine, and many other primary sources and secondary sources, which will be printed in my finalized thesis. And the next slide after that, I just have my images used. I wanted to give credit where credit is due. They were awesome images to find, and I think they really make this presentation pop. And I want to thank you guys for listening to my presentation today. I really appreciate it. I have put a lot of work and effort into this year-long thesis, and a small presentation doesn't quite give me enough space to show all the research and depth that I have in it. However, I hope this interests you to read my thesis, which will be completed very soon. So thank you all for your time and have a great day.